I would like to welcome you all to this session in the European Science Policy Forum, which is labeled as a local session, but you'll see that it's not really local as we kept it. The topic of today is data access for research, where the background is that obviously everybody is aware of the increasing amounts of information available in society, and with the path that we're taking towards digitalization and the new role of artificial intelligence and machine learning, for instance, in different types of research, it is very important that we have access to this data. At the same time, you see forces that, for instance, driven by public awareness of what the potential of these types of technologies is, that tighten the access both in a legislative way and in a policy way. There are legal aspects to this, sometimes ethical aspects, there are security and technical questions. So it's a big topic. I'm very happy to have four eminent experts on board today whom I would like to introduce to you. I don't know whether you see them in the same order as I do, but I start in my upper left corner, and that is Professor Hedvig Kjellström, a colleague at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm. She's a professor in the Division of Robotics, Perception and Learning, and also principal AI scientist at Silo AI, and affiliated with the Max Planck Institute in Germany. She received her PhD in computer science from KTH in 2001, and after that worked with the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and then joined back at KTH, which we're very happy about, known as a colleague. Hedvig, you are somebody who really works on development of the technology. Would you have a short statement about what is the role of data in your type of research?
Yes. So my research area is, you could say, it's AI in the modern sense, and of course the dominating methodology there is machine learning. So we are heavily relying on data for training our models. So today I would like to make sure that we discuss 3 points. So the first is open access. So it's really important for privacy and integrity that so it's really important for reproducibility of our results, that you can access the data used for training our models to replicate the results. But of course it's also important to at the same time ensure the privacy and integrity of people that have been recorded. And the second point is interpretability and transparency of AI models. So it's really important to design models so that you can understand how they came about to their decisions. So firstly, to have a human in the loop, applications like decision support, which I think personally is the most interesting strand of AI. But also, of course, to understand about biases, sort of what biases the model has learned. For example, facial recognition systems that know more about Caucasian people, for example. And you can even use the model to discover biases in data. So that brings me to the third point, which I think we should discuss, is about ethics. It's an important area in both AI and data science, of course, to discover underlying patterns and causal chains and correlations in data biases. And I think we can use AI methods to help with that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then in my screen, the next person is Sylvia Botano. She's a legal officer at the Open Science at the European Commission's Director General for Research and Innovation. Long titles, as we're used to in the EU context. She works in the Open Science unit, like I said, where she contributes to the further development and implementation of the European Open Science Agenda. And before that, she coordinated the Open Science Working Group of the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities, which has some Swedish representation as well, as far as I know. And she also worked as a policy officer for European federations. Sylvia, thanks for joining us. It also makes it less Swedish. Question to you, what is access to data in your day-to-day job?
Yes, thanks very much, Sebastian, for the question, and good afternoon, everyone. And of course, I will bring in the debate the perspective of open science, because the timely sharing and access to research data is, of course, an important open science practice. Maybe not everyone is familiar with what open science is, but it's really an approach to the scientific process, which is based on sharing knowledge and tools as early and as widely as possible in the research process among researchers, of course, but also with the society at large as well. And of course, sharing of data plays an important part here. And we think that as well, access, reuse of data, sharing of data contributes really to increase the impact, the efficiency, but also the quality of product and the productivity of research. And of course, we work in this area also within the next framework program for research and innovation to put into place the right framework condition so that this can happen more in the future. I just wanted to, maybe there are two things that I think would be interesting to discuss. And one is, of course, how we can facilitate access to data and proper research data management from a regulatory perspective. What are the legislation that we can put in place? But then secondly, it's also how we do these let's say in our research programs and as funders, how we ensure that that proper research data management in line with FAIR principles of findability, accessibility of the data, interoperability and reusability are ensured. And I think I will just stop after this brief introduction, but we have seen in the COVID-19 pandemic how important is the sharing of data. And we see it not only for public health responses, but also for research. And sharing data, the COVID-19 pandemic has proved that it can really save lives, because we have seen how important this was for the development of testing, for the development of the vaccine. Yet we have seen also a lot of challenges, like the fact that research data still scores poorly in terms of fairness. And also we have seen as well that many publications, also the COVID-19 publication, the underlying data, underlying the publication are not always available. So there was a recent study from that actually showed that 9% only of articles in Europe PMC, I'm talking about COVID-19 articles, have a data availability statement. And even when they have the criteria for accessing the data is often ambiguous. So there is quite a bit of work to do in this direction. And maybe last thing that I think will be important to discuss in this debate is, of course, about the policy framework that we need, but also the incentives and the rewards, because we see so much that a crucial obstacle and challenge in sharing the data, but also making data reusable, is actually that we don't have the right incentives, and we need to reform the research assessment system so that these practices are much more valued for researchers to undertake them in the future. So these are some first ideas from my side.
Thank you, Sylvia. Then I would like to continue with Dr. Matthias Aikman. We just concluded that the summer house roof was already visible with two of the panelists, showing at least some of the local flavor. But Matthias is Director Industry Solutions Healthcare at Microsoft, and part of the health and life science team in Microsoft Western Europe. He works particularly with the key stakeholders at governments and healthcare organizations, as well as with startups to accelerate the digital transformation. He joined Microsoft in 2014, and before that he had several positions as a consultant at consultant companies in connected vehicles, advanced analytics, and related types of technologies. Matthias, thank you for joining us as well. asking the role of data for an IT giant like Microsoft. What is your take on the importance of it?
Yeah, and thank you, Sebastian, and extremely glad to be part of this discussion. And I think, as both Hedvig and Sylvia outlined, it is that we're moving into a place where technology is used in totally different way. I often say that up to now, maybe we have stored digital information, but what is happening now is that we digitalize the social contract. And I should say that especially in healthcare, this is like critical, because the advancements that we can do by AI or data-driven science could, both from a preventive perspective, but also from a disease detection perspective, give new clues. And there I think that from our perspective as a large company, we are the tools company, so supporting a lot of the regions or healthcare organization. And I think that one critical aspect that also should be discussed is a lot of the amazing research that is done that historically just became a publication in a paper magazine is in fact also a mathematical model today, that if you want, you can bring that from research into clinical practice to use for society in a matter of seconds. If you can do this like that step in a transparent and trustworthy way that Hedvig outlined. So I think that sometimes we have an overestimation of all the data that we have stored up to now, because that has been stored by the bias of society. So it's not obviously for me that all collected data is collected in an unbiased, fair, transparent way. And exactly as Sylvia outlined, a lot of the COVID research that we have seen is then presented, but there is a lack of understanding what the granularity around that type of data. And that, I think, that coming to the trust that Hedvig was pointing out, the trust from me as a patient, how can I trust the system? Because the systems need my data to do this, like overall data science and learning. So I think that the entire feedback loop, from like the patient generating data to the advanced research, and how do we come back so society gain value for that, that I think is a critical thing to discuss as well.
Oh, sorry, unmute. Thank you a lot. I also see a nice area emerging already for the discussion, which leads me to introducing the last panelist, and that is Professor Dan Hill. Dan, you and I know each other a bit longer, and you have more professor positions than than I can list here. However, they include the Design Academy Eindhoven, UCL, Oslo School of Architecture, and there was Australia, RMIT, I guess. Yeah. But however, I ask you because you are the Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, and if there are any international people in our audience, Vinnova is the innovation funding agency in Sweden. The role of data for the work of an innovation agency, then, what would you say there as a role?
Yeah, just quickly, very few of my professor positions are real ones like yours, Seb. Most of them are adjuncts or visiting. But yes, I'm director, as you said, of Vinnova, the Swedish government's innovation agency. And I think actually, just underscoring the way you introduced it, what I'm interested in is pulling research and the data associated with that closer to everyday life, I guess. And by which I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't have room for blue sky research, exploratory research. I don't mean everything should be applied. I just mean closing the gaps in some respects, so that pulling it together, we can then start using that data in a really genuinely effective way at the front line around the missions that we need to do in the next, let's say, 10 years, or probably less in reality. So we're driven by, as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals, by Swedish national policy, by various European Union targets around climate crisis, around health crises, around social justice, and so on. Many of the missions that we're working on, and Seb, you're part of some of these, we're of course wanting to use all kinds of data and to support, let's say, more systemic or holistic approaches to decision-making, more informed approaches to decision-making, again, at the front line. But then within that context, I want to just unpick that a little bit. My background is really computer science to begin with. So, you know, I was doing artificial intelligence a long, long time ago. And it shows how long it takes to get to meaningful frontline. I think I graduated in 1992 and we were doing AI then. And I still haven't really, well, I guess Spotify use machine learning a lot to make Spotify work, but it's hard to see where else it is around us. It's around us, but we can't see it. But my other work was in urban sociology. That's what my master's degree is in. And that immediately is where I wanted to just start with this discussion around how we use data and how we don't use data. How data is used most effectively to underscore decision-making, to understand policy making, to understand what we need to fund as an agency or how we need to collaborate. But then equally the very real limits of data. And I want to pick up a little bit on what Hedvig said about human in the loop and just come back to the importance of that perspective and really understanding that data is always highly contingent and very contextual. So, you know, it comes from, I think Timothy Morton pointed out, data comes from the Latin datum, which is related to dare, I think, which means to give. So it's something you work with as a material. It's not a fact in itself. It's something to be interpreted and turned into something. And that's really incredibly powerful, but it also shows again the hard limits of that. So what I'm trying to do at Vinnova is understand, how do we use data towards these missions that we need to do? How do we use them for public value, for civic value? But then how do we train policymakers, politicians, citizens, citizen scientists, other scientists, designers, architects, whomever, to work with data in that highly contingent sense, to understand that there are very hard limits to what you can do with it, and equally it has value. And that's really challenging. The way that data is talked about, in my world at least, of usually working with cities, where people are talking about things like digital twins a lot, for instance, you know, as in, let's say, very detailed big data led models of cities that you in theory can run predictions and do speculative work with. That's a very old idea. Jay Forrester at MIT was talking about that in the 1960s. He said you could reduce the problems of a city down to 200 parameters played across 150 equations. And that is not true. So as we saw at the time, it's far more complex than that. And what he was talking about there was in the context of a certain kind of way of thinking as well, a sort of very technocratic, almost cybernetician's way of thinking about data. If we can only capture all the variables, feed them through the right algorithms, then the answer will pop out and we've solved things. But he was talking in the context of his work around housing policy under the Nixon administration, for instance. And all of their models always showed that public housing doesn't work. You know, it's not going to work. It's not going to take unemployed people out of their poverty. And we just know that, again, evidence has shown over the last 40, 50 years since then that that's not true. There is lots of examples of public housing all over the world, from Austria or Switzerland, the Netherlands, wherever, where that has worked. So it's entirely due to the political context or the ideology or whatever you want to think about, whatever the word is underlying that. So what I'm trying to understand then, and I'll close on this thought, is the immense value of working with data, public data, civic data in particular, from my point of view, getting that stuff out there in public to understand how we address the challenges we need. But equally, how do we not fall into the trap that Forrester did of assuming that we can capture the data and it will give us the answer, you know, necessarily, that we understand that data is a material to work with, that it's highly contextual, it's framed in ideologies and human foibles and frailties, which is what makes us a wonderful species potentially. So how do we then train people to understand what data is, how to work with it, the limits of it and the possibilities of it? That's behind the work that you and I are talking about, Seb, but behind the approach to Vinnova.
Thanks a lot. I hear all of you lifting the contextuality of data and the importance of knowing the frameworks in which it has been collected. If we couple that to the question, like, how do we enable research on those cross-disciplinary topics that are essential, particularly when put into the context of the SDGs, whereas part of that access to data is actually restricted because it is private data or it's privacy protected, military protected. What would be your answer regarding the balance that we need to strike there for the policy regarding data access for the next 5 years, so to say? If I can start with Dan.
I think the more we understand, I guess we knew this deep down, but that things are interconnected and systemic, that those boundaries begin to fade away a little bit. And so I'm really interested in questions of privacy, because I think we've taken a very limited view of what privacy is. And I don't mean that it's not a thing. I just mean that it's been very narrowly framed in GDPR and lots of other things. And I'm not sure it's going to help us with the next challenge, which again is understanding everything is interconnected. And again, to borrow Timothy Morton quote, the philosopher, he talks about air conditioning. He says, you sort of air conditioning makes the air in the room cooler. And he says, well, it doesn't really. It just moves the hot air outside into the street. It's still the same temperature overall. In fact, you probably made everything a bit hotter because you've used energy to do it. So it's the same molecules essentially moving around. And this very narrow black and white definition, this is mine, that is outside. I'm private in my house and the street is public. And that car is private and that the street is public. These are very narrow binary black and white distinctions which don't capture any of the externalities of those things. We know the car has an impact on the street. If we're putting a car in a public parking space, it's privatizing that space briefly, for instance, even though it's public space still. So I think we're going to need a much richer definition of understanding of things like privacy. And again, this is by metaphor, but the Japanese architect Su Fujimoto said that the inside of your house is just the most private part of the city, which is a nice way of thinking about it. You're in the middle of a city, you're still in the city, you're still public in that sense, but there's a kind of a relationship which shifts from a more private way of being. And as you move towards the front door, you're getting more and more public. And when you're in the streets, you're more and more public again. But even in the street, you're in your neighborhood, which is some relationship to you. And then as you go further and further, you're getting more and more public. So it's sort of, I'm interested in these kind of much more nuanced shifting relationships around data. And that has to get away from this understanding of blunt public, blunt private. With the EU Decode project that I was part of, which was a civic data project led out of Amsterdam and Barcelona, we were really giving citizens the right to express how they wanted their data to be shared in public on their terms. So it was kind of data to do with their life, but because they're in a city, they could make that public and civic if they wanted to. It's kind of up to them in that sense. And there was a kind of a negotiation there, a fluidity you could imagine playing out, which would respect an individual position, but recognize you are part of massively connected systems, and that could be of value and benefit. So I know that's a little bit philosophical, but I guess I'm interested in this kind of moving away from public and private and understanding that they are totally connected, utterly interconnected. And there's actually numerous kind of, again, almost like an old Japanese house, shifting screens of relationships between those two different states. And how do we understand that data can move through those different spaces? That would be really profoundly interesting and probably would help us with some of the systemic challenges, which just don't respect boundaries at all, as we know. So it would be not to say that, Sylvia, we need to open the lid on GDPR and redo it all again. But I'd be interested to understand, again, how the rest of the panel here think about these kind of more nuanced relationships between public and private in that respect, vis-a-vis data.
Well, Sylvia, just to you got the ball, and there's also the question in the chat on like the GDPR as a potential obstacle. How do you think about this?
Yeah, so I think that the question and the balance between openness and on the other side, restricted and control access, that it's respectful of what our values and existing rules and principles, such as, for example, data protection and privacy, is quite important. But I think if we also agree that data is a common good, and the vision that data is the cornerstone of future science, and we want to minimize, in a sense, that data and access to data is being restricted by industrial privacy or other reason, I think one very important message is that the architecture baseline for any initiative that aims to federate the data should abide to the principle that we have enshrined in some policies and as well in the framework program, and it's the principle of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So we say that, for example, data should be as open as possible, meaning that data should be open by default, should be as closed as necessary, meaning that we should take into account, for example, legitimate interests such as commercial exploitation or any other constraints like intellectual property rights, trade secrets. And if we keep this balance right, I think this is a good framework that helps us in understanding how data can be shared. And I also want to point out that some of the lessons that we have learned, I think, during the pandemic and some of the things, so as you know, we have the European COVID-19 data platform, which was part of the ERA versus Corona action plan, and that actually enabled to share data regarding COVID-19, genomic data as well, and various different types of data. And it's based on a federated model, so the Federated European Genome Phenome Archive. So these it's a model that allows, and actually where different member states build each one a national node that it's connected to a central node. So the data are not traveling actually, but the metadata are exposed in this central archive, and knowing where the data are and how can be accessed, this enable research to request access to the data, work on the data, while in a secure environment that it's in compliance with EU and national regulatory frameworks, including the GDPR. So there's a solution and this federated infrastructure and this secure, let's say, environment that enable the processing and the use and acting on the data in compliance with what are privacy rules and data protection frameworks, including the GDPR. And I think it's worth exploring and building on these use cases and see how, what are the challenges that they encountered and how this can be overcome in the future.
Thanks. That mentions also the importance of having those infrastructures in place. And Matthias, what do you see there? Is that already mature, or is that something that will expand, and what rule set would allow that the tool set to further expand?
Yeah, a good question. And also I think I really like how you frame it, Dan, this like that it's more like a span that we need to be better to look into how data is handled. And I think that what we have not done so much up to now, talked how technology can enable that type of differentiation on how you share or the sensitivity, because it has been to a large extent on the legislation perspective or policy perspective, but we have not looked into how modern technology could be a support of not having this black and white. And I think especially also in healthcare, I should say, and in the Nordics, where, I mean, we have a risk-based approach by risk sharing through how we pay tax, because it's a tax finance healthcare system. But still we are lacking the opportunity for the healthcare system to leverage the data in an effective way across different organizations. And that also, I think we should discuss. It's not just the GDPR from the perspective, my data and how I can share my data to Hedvig for research, but it's also for the society. If we decide, as we have done in the Nordics, that it's a fair tax-paid healthcare system, then that system needs to leverage the data that is generated by me, by my traveling, because if learnings from my patient journey can make the healthcare system more sustainable in the future by my data being part of a model that could be shared, then I think that we need to start to discuss that. How can we in fact have, with some sense of consent, or how we structure it, but it cannot be that every time we would like to build a model to make the entire system more effective, we need to pass this complex research processes where we have trouble to moving back the model. Sometimes I would like to see that more in the system. And then coming back to your question, Sebastian, then I think that the platforms needs to be much better on all parties, because if we are like ending up in the complexity of these other things, if we also make it complex through a technology perspective to move the model, then it's really complex. But I think what we are lacking is how can technology simplify, so to say, the differentiation of how we handle data across the system.
Well, Hedvig, that immediately brings up your research area, so you're muted.
Sorry, you should have learned after 18 months. That's super interesting, and I think it also connects to computing resources. So basically, so essentially, in order to use the data for example, AI, you need to be, you don't really need access to the raw data, but if you had computing resources within the same firewalls as the data, you could deploy training sessions there on these computing resources. And yeah, so I'm not sure whom this is directed towards, but maybe to Sylvia. So how is EU working with computing resources?
On computing resources, I'm not sure I will be the right person to reply, but certainly there is an effort in trying to federate existing infrastructures for the sharing of data. So for example, you might have heard about an initiative that we have, the European Open Science Cloud, which really aims to create a virtual environment for the sharing of not only for the sharing, but for the storage, sharing, processing, and analysis of digital objects, so publication, but also data and software, and not only across countries, but also across disciplines. So there is a bit of work that it's going into that direction. This has been done so far through some projects financed under Horizon 2020, but in the future there is a new partnership, a new EOSC partnership, which just started very recently. The Memorandum of Understanding was signed last week during the RNI Days, the European Research and Innovation Days, and we believe that this is the cornerstone of a future data space for science, research, and innovation. And probably not sure about the computing aspect, but certainly this will be an important I think tool to make sure that that the data are shared more across countries and different sectors.
I know, for example, about the EuroHPC initiative. Yeah. That is, thanks.
Dan, you flagged as well.
Yeah, just picking up a few of the threads here. I think it was interesting how Matthias said it's when in a Nordic context, at least, you have the idea of a public health system as an asset, a key asset, and in a sense we invest in it with our tax. It's an interesting way of thinking about it, and being able to use that asset effectively for the people, it's a public asset in that way. So the data, therefore, is a public asset, which we want to be able to leverage, as Matthias said, most powerfully. Partly also to make it sustainable, because as we know, it's increasingly expensive, and because of various issues, lifestyle-related illnesses and other things, it's getting increasingly expensive, and that's not going to show any sign of going down anytime soon. So we need to understand how to leverage that in the most powerful way from just a basic sustainability of the healthcare system point of view. But then there's this kind of ethical dimension again, is how do we use the data more effectively to prevent people from getting sick in the first place? And that's where you want it sort of leaping out of the fish pond of health research into the fish pond of, urban research, for instance. So to create environments that are health nurturing by default. And we know what they look like from an architecture and urban planning point of view. But it's very hard to get, as said, this is something you and I are talking about all the time now. How do you actually get urban designers, urban planners, and politicians that frame their decisions understanding the value of, let's say, reforesting a city in a sense, creating playgrounds or clean air and drinking water or walkable environments? All of those things we have endless amounts of data about. The Netherlands, where you're from, said, it's like the value of the cycling culture in the Netherlands is billions of euros a year. It's something like 3 or 4% of GDP. As a value in terms of healthcare savings, right? So that's leaving aside its value as an industry. That's just literally the healthcare savings alone. I mean, that's almost the same as, the car industry makes for Sweden. So it's like, it's a significant amount of GDP, and we can either choose to spend it on the hospital end of the problem or the biking end of the problem, if you see what I mean. And I prefer the biking end, just to be clear, because ethically, if we know that would prevent people from getting sick, that would seem to be the right thing to do, I'd have thought. But that data is nowhere near the front line. The data exists in journals, which is great. And as Sylvia said, we can open the journals up more and more. But how do they connect to tools, cultures of decision-making at the front line? Again, understanding the limits of the data as well, as I said. How do we make sure that's legible, so it's understandable for people? The more we use machine learning to refine those decisions, or in decision support contexts, how do we explain that to people? In the old days, a planning document, there is a public document there, at least. You can go to the town hall, you can see it. No one ever did, but it's still a kind of, it exists in the record, and it's written in a form of language, right? So when it's code, how do we do that? So that legibility is super important, and the closer we bring it to the front line. But the closer we bring it to the front line, the greater the value of the data is in that sense. And that's where I'd love to see, again, the privacy question is then framed in a different way if we apply that ethical dimension to it. So instead of, how do we use that data for, let's say, healthcare research, it's how do we use that data to prevent people getting sick in the first place? We might find that data becomes even more useful in that sense. And we begin to understand, well, how do we do that ethically, transparently, and legibly?
Given that we're at the Science Policy Forum, there's also an amount of role here to play for academic policy. So Hedwig, how do you see this discussion playing out at how we should manage our universities?
How we should manage the universities? I don't know. But
well, to refine the question, a lot of the incentive structures for individual researchers is to push out in as many papers as possible to high quality outlet journals, and to not care about the rest, and also to become niche researchers instead of doing what Dan now says, connecting the different dots together. How do you see that working out in academic structures?
I do think it's a problem with over publication and so on, but I think I'm more of an optimist than you. So I think there is a strong development towards open science and open data and reproducibility. So I think we should sort of, and a lot of conferences in my area are enforcing that you sign sort of, for example, NeurIPS, which is the biggest machine learning conference, there you sort of fill out ethics declaration where you explain how how you've taken everything into account. So I think that now I lost track, but so I think we should, the universities should, to a great extent possible, help their researchers to be more publish more openly and so on. I think also we should work on how to, so KTH is just undergoing a research evaluation. So they measure all kinds of things like publication statistics, and in quite skewed ways, which is, of course, it's very hard for a single university to change this, but it's very frustrating for the professors, because we are measured against one system in these evaluations and in another system in our fields. For example, in my field, you publish in conferences. That's the main, and it's much more dynamic. It moves, and that improves multidisciplinarity, and like turnaround time becomes shorter. So I think that is addressing what Dan brought up, that you can bring stuff out to the real world faster, but the academic evaluation promotes journal publications in high impact journals where it takes maybe 3 years to publish a paper. And that is not in accordance with the strides that Dan described. So maybe we should all do lobbyism towards, so I don't know who we should lobby for, but over to Dan maybe.
First, I would like to ask Matthias, because industry perspective is very important before we zoom into, let's say, either the European funding or the Vinnova funding. Matthias.
So the question.
The question then, what should we do about policies regarding science if we want to promote this cross-disciplinary work with data like Dan described?
Yeah, I think, and I mean, Hedvig pointed it out. It part of how you measure that you create behaviors, and I think that there needs to be going forward in these like high level evaluations to see how fast research can be implemented for the value of society. I think that type of dimension, because I think from a technology perspective, as also had been mentioned in the beginning, we have vision recognition. The technology in the space of AI is going so fast. So I think that there is a risk that we are moving into some more like black box situation where the general person or user of that doesn't understand what does it mean that the risk is 72% of this patient coming back in 3 months. So we have this like skilling part for being able as having AI as assistive technology. But I think it's important for the research side to take some responsibility. How can we educate the people that should use this research that is more like mathematically generated? So that dimension needs to come into place. And also I think that since this speed thing, I think it's a risk if we're not starting to apply some of these things in real life. The risk is that the research and technology is so good So we will end up with this black box that we just need to use because otherwise the healthcare system, for example, will not be sustainable. It will cost too much, and we will see the earnings on the technology, but we have not used the 2, 3, 5 years coming now to understand how to interact with that technology. So that is why, as I said in the beginning, I think that we are in this tipping point where we in fact are digitalizing the social contract, my contract to society. And that will build on top of world-leading research. But we really fast needs to start to implement that and learn from that type of digital interaction. And that is, I think, it would be good if we could see that type of metrics on the researcher side also, that they start to take responsibility how to push the research into general use, rather than we are like just hoping that the industry, a packed solution will solve that, because that I think could be very dangerous.
Well, there clearly an innovation agency has a role then.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of almost like fast and slow data, or fast and slow understanding, maybe. And the idea that what you and Hedvig were both sort of implying, Sebastian, was that there's the slowness of the academic process is maybe overemphasized, and so there's the peer-review journal process, and that's how you're accredited, and how we all are, I guess. But then we were talking about the ability to get that data out to the front line as well. And that's also interesting, but I think that we have to recognize the value in both of them. There is a value, of course, to the peer-reviewed journal process, and that's a kind of a slow process on purpose. And it has immense value as a result. And equally, that doesn't preclude us, though, having you know, an open data platform publishing real-time data from the same research. It's just that we want to understand what's fast and what's slow, and what's been really well considered, and what is open and exploratory. And that's what I meant earlier by being legible, having a kind of an immediate sense where, you know, if I'm a policymaker or a politician, I can understand, okay, that looks interesting, but there is only, you know, 4 months worth of case study there. Whereas this one has, you know, 40,000 people on it over 18 years. Okay, that's a different kind of thing. And how do we understand, how do we get that language out there so we can do both? And I think it's interesting. I can't believe I'm bringing up COVID. I didn't mean to. But with COVID, you know, we've had to move very quickly and understand the value of vaccines and the risk associated with them. So some of those vaccines, yes, there's a risk, a percentage risk, and politicians have had to put that into practice. And research environments have had to produce things very, very quickly. And we sort of understand there's a risk, but the risk is worth taking because the risk of not doing it is enormous. And we have to probably start thinking in a similar way, as we all know, probably around climate and health and social justice accordingly. There is a risk of not doing these things, which is far greater than the risk of doing some of these things. And so refining this language around risk, understanding the how we use data to inform decisions, which data is, let's say, rock solid as best as we can make it, and then which data is exploratory and open. And we want lots of people feeding off both of them, right? You know, because off the open exploratory data, we'll find incredible innovations and inventions that we can't possibly foresee. And people will also find the holes in it. You know, if you open it up, they'll say, well, that isn't thought through because of this, this, or this. Or this case disproves that case, right? So if we get academia to a point where they feel comfortable with exposing both fast and slow thinking, if you like, and fast and slow data, both of them have value. And then we have the outside world working with those things, but understanding the risk of using the fast data versus the diminished risk of using the slow data. But you still might make the case to use the fast data because the risk of not doing anything at all is now so great. And so that would be interesting if we can start framing a language around that, or maybe people know there is a language that I'm missing, but I'm not sure we talk about data in that respect that much.
So Sylvia, how would you go about cooking a soup out of this?
No, I just wanted to come back to the issue of rewards and incentive and how we reform the research assessment, because this is an area in which we are doing quite a fair bit of work, and we are now in dialogue with research performing organization and research funding organization on how the research assessment system can be reformed in a way that a much wider variety of outputs and tasks are rewarded, not just publication and publication in high impact factor journal, but really, as I said, a much variety of tasks and outputs. And I see, as we have said, and also as Edwig said, we see a demand as well for open science, and we see an uptake of open science practices much more now. And when we talk about open science, many people think only about open data or open access to publication, but no, it's really about the entire research process. And so, for example, early and open sharing of research to preprints, register reports and other tools, and also open peer review, because now we see also arising different publishing models, and the European Commission is piloting one of these models. We have launched a new publishing platform called Open Research Europe, which is innovative in the sense that after pre-publication checks, all the papers are published as a preprint, so they are available for the scrutiny of everyone. All the reviews, the peer reviews are open and can be citable with their own DOI, so they are assigned a persistent identifier, and that's a way as well to value much more peer review. And then importantly, we ask as well in this publishing platform for a data availability statement, and that all data underlining a publication can be also cited and have their own DOI. And this is very important as well for the reproducibility of science, because what we want to encourage as well, as Edwig said, is that we see that a lot of research is not reproducible. And as a funder, we have the responsibility as well to make sure, because we are talking about a publicly funded research, in this case that we finance through the Framework Program for Research and Innovation, to make sure that for example, the tools, the instruments, the data that underlie a publication are openly available or accessible for those who want to validate the conclusions that came in. And so I think there is really room in the future to change the behaviors so that we value a much wider range of outputs. And this, of course, is not for the European Commission to do top down, but it's really something, a joint effort that needs to be done between research performing organization and research funding organization. But these are, I think, the way forward, so that that research data management and these practices are much more valued in the future.
Interesting. Yes. There was also this question in the chat about if all the data will be accessible, what would we then do with an equality problem, because different universities, research organizations, maybe even different countries have very different access to resources. Matthias, I know that the company that you work for does quite something in this domain. What would be your perspective there?
Yeah, I think that first, one angle of the openness, I think that also ties to future IP discussions, because if you would like to move this general idea or something into some solution that solves something, I think that also from a contractual perspective, how do we ensure that small and medium-sized companies can build on top of this research that is basically built on top of data generated in research and could be personal data in that sense. And that, I think we worked a lot with trying to help frame contracts. And of course, it's easier in the open space to try to start to frame a set of general contracts that could be used between data generators and future IP players. So I think that is also a very important component, and the activity we done that from a Microsoft perspective was not to try to build a Microsoft contract, but rather to build a first iteration of a set of writings that maybe other vendors and organizations could start to agree on, because I think that if we have a totally different way of doing the legal construct, then it will be fairly complicated. So I think that type of general initiatives in this like open data or open research perspective, I think that we need to come together, more bodies to frame that. But that was one of our contributions to try to harmonize a first statement on how we could do that. Because at the end of the day, if you would like to build an AI model that is based on Hedvig's research, how do I ensure that data can be used in that way? So I think that is a critical aspect as well.
Thank you. I'm looking at the clock. We have 5 minutes left. I thought let's do a short round of what did you pick up as the immediate action points that you in your own organization would want to work at, as well as one point that you would like another organization to work at, policy-wise. Dan.
A really interesting conversation, so thank you. And I take away from this sort of sense of the need to make data work and then learn how to work with data. So, you know, this sense of really the potential of opening up in the way that everybody's been describing, but then the responsibility to understand what working with data means, and that we take that through both science and academic research, but then as it drifts into policy making or moments of everyday life, how people understand the limits of the possibilities of it. That we need to really develop this kind of vocabulary and fluency with it. So to speak it like a language. And so I think, yeah, this sense of a vocabulary is something maybe that I'll think about a bit more specifically in terms of our work. And I would love other people here as well to think about then how does this connect out of the, as I said, like the fish pond of health research. How do we draw the learning from that into then the everyday environments, and whether they're employment contracts or neighborhood design that can cause poor health and well-being? How do we use data to really go ahead in that direction, upstream, if you like? That's what I'd love us to work on more as a community here.
Thank you. Hedvig, you're muted.
Yes, so I must agree. This was super interesting conversation, and I really have a lot of new thoughts. So I think what I would like to bring home is to so I think this notion of open science and transparency. Not only transparency in the models we build in my research, but also in the whole scientific process. It's super important, and peer review is one of those. So, I mean, publication speed is good, but not at the expense of more sort of flaky peer evaluation. So I'm gonna think more about that. And yeah, so I think for so I don't want to give orders to anyone else, but I think it's really important to think about how data can be accessible for researchers in all of Europe. And also not only the raw data, but also infrastructure for doing AI research on that data. So it's really important to accompany the data sort of warehouses with computational resources.
Thank you. Sylvia, well, your point was taken home by Hedvig.
No, I think it's difficult to wrap up on further actions because there are, I guess, many and much more that we can still continue to do in this path. But I think for us as a policymaker and as a research funder, I see that there is still room for us to continue to work in this area and support the communities and research communities so that they can have access to data, so that we help them as well in research data management endeavor. We support them and we make sure that that we don't create divides, because I think the comment in the chat was really very important, that we should support all communities, not just those who are the most advanced in this area, but also others, so that we create really strong European research area where everybody is really on the same page and we are stronger together. An action for the others, I don't know, because it's also an action for us as well. How do we as research funding organization, research performing organization, how do we continue to support our communities? How do we reward much more these practices in a way that that it's meaningful and that can advance and make progress? So that's the wrap up from my side.
Yes, and then Matthias.
Yeah, and for me, I think the take on action is to see how can technology support the policy development and maybe accelerate some of these different part of seeing of the sensitivity of data that Dan was taking on. And I think maybe an action for Vinnova in Sweden, maybe we should try to figure out how could we do this like cross-learning project where we not just state that everything needs to change, but realize that we need to work in terms of the structures and legislation that exist today. But how can we in fact go through this journey and go from world-leading research to benefits for society, and try to figure out what is the policy or technology aspect that needs to be added to that thinking to be able to do it today. And then of course have this long list of wishes for Santa that should be like changes in part of this. But I think it's important, as you said, then some of the things we need to do it now. I mean, there are patients in the system that could benefit from this, and it's part of Sweden that could be more healthier if we like recreate how we build things or design things. So it's this long term versus the short term.
Thank you so much. We drew 2 minutes over time, and the funny observation is that we're at the height of summer here in Sweden. It's still a local session, and you mentioned Santa. So I think what we need is a summer holiday at first. I would like to thank you very much for participating in an interesting session. Also, thank you to the participants. I think we had a really nice conversation and some homework to do, all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you.